Hi, everyone. This is Karen Smiley. Welcome to 6Ps and AI Pods. This post is part of our AI 6P interview series on AI, software, and wetware. Our guests share their experiences with using AI and how they feel about AI using their data and content. I'm delighted to welcome Jennifer McRae from Canada as my guest today on AI, software, and wetware. Jen, thank you so much for joining me on this interview. Please tell us about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Yeah, Karen, thank you so much for having me. I've really admired your work since we connected, so it's really cool to be doing this. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I'm a writer and independent strategist, and I've spent the last 20 years working at the intersection of the future of work and learning, broadly speaking. I publish a Substack called Fuck, I Love You, and we'll call it Philly from this point forward in the interview. On that Substack, I write broadly speaking about cultural transformation, or as I often talk about it, is radical imaginations for futures worth living in. And I'm very convinced by Terence McKenna's idea that culture is your operating system. And so my thesis or the base assumption underneath of Philly and all of the work that I do in general is that we're living in this time of very significant transformation. And what I've seen in all of my foresight work over, we're going on 20 years now, is I see this attempting emergent relational cultural operating system. And so I say we're moving from a transactional operating system to a relational one. I've more recently simplified this or talk about this as we're upgrading the operating system from the old good life to the new good life. And I really see that new good life, it has a relational foundation, and I see love as relationality. It's not a feeling, it's a thing that you do. And it's really the core of everything. And so I think about that a lot. I write about that a lot. And to me, AI has a lot to do with that. And so you'll find very strong AI themes on my Substack and as well as neurodivergence, partially because it's my lived experience, but partially because I think the old good life, if you will, really tried to force us down this track of a cognitive monoculture. There's one right way of doing, of thinking, of being. And I think what's emerging in relationality is a cognitive polyculture. And I think it's really important to talk about cognitive diversity because all humans have cognition and it's relational. It's about the way that your brain and neurobiology interacts with culture and environment. And I think that that's a very inclusive way to think about it. We have so much to be gained from thinking about cognitive diversity. And I've written some pieces exploring the relationship between AI and cognitive diversity. I think there's some really interesting similarities I see between my own brain and the way that AI, and I've also written a lot about AI as a cognitive prosthetic and to reduce what I and sometimes others call the translation tax. My experience is that it allows a brain like mine that's really can't help itself but go toward complexity and patterns and deep dives and systemic insights. That's not very compatible with transactional. Quick, give me the insight, give me the deck, give me five talking points. AI is really supportive, I find, in reducing those transactional barriers. And transactionality is still the dominant paradigm. It's still very economically deterministic. I think that's a really interesting thing to explore. To wrap up, I'd say, speaking of economic imperatives, I do have a strategy practice, a consulting practice. I'm returning to it after a very long medical leave, so it's restarting slowly. I do offer insights into that practice. I have a section on my Substack called Futures Worth Living In, and that's my more applied work, I'd say. If I was speaking consultant, I would say that I support leaders and organizations to navigate these structural shifts that we're experiencing in work, learning, and economic participation. And the last thing I'm up to right now is my business partner, Anna, and I are working on a deep work retreat where we're trying to translate all of these ideas about relationality and cognitive diversity to think about our environment as an intervention into our state. And we feel really strongly that our state determines our outcomes. So, how can we offer an environment that helps people shift into ideally flow and have protected time to do the really important, creative, strategic, deep work that's really hard to get to when you're interrupted something like 275 times a day, Microsoft found last year. We really want to explore environment as an intervention, and that's going to be offered this fall. There's a website you can check out if you're interested.
That sounds like a really interesting workshop. I had to chuckle when you mentioned the number of interruptions because that tracks. When I was working in corporate life, especially, I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. Microsoft, it's fascinating. I wrote a piece that they put out a report where they actually documented that because they can go in and look at all the data from Microsoft 365 and Teams. They actually analyzed and found that the average knowledge worker is experiencing 205 interruptions a day. The cognitive load of that is shocking. So, yeah, none of us are really working. We're just routing information.
Yeah, in computer terms, we used to call that thrashing when you could go back and forth and never get anything actually done. I do remember seeing studies a long time ago that whenever there's one interruption, especially in software, you've got the mental model of the code that you're working on, and someone pops in with a question and it breaks your mental model, and you've got to start rebuilding it all over again. And interruptions would cost people 15 to 30 minutes each time. So then how do you ever get anything done? It's amazing.
I love that. That's a really great frame to think about it that way. And there's also a documented evidence-based thing now. Like 15 to 30 minutes is totally accurate. Yeah, your lived experience checks out, Karen.
Yeah, I think that study may have been from Microsoft too back in the day. It's quite some years ago. I'll see if I can dig it up because now I'm curious about whether or not it's held up. But I can't imagine that it wouldn't have. I don't think it's gotten any better.
Yeah, no, not with Slack and all these other teams and everything else.
Yeah, very, very, very true. So you mentioned that you do write a bit about AI. Could you tell us about your level of experience with AI and machine learning and analytics, whether you've used it professionally or personally, or if you've ever studied any of the technologies?
Yeah, I would call myself a passionate amateur. I am a non-technical user. Um, I really came at AI first totally curiosity driven. I was like, what is this thing that everybody's talking about? Why are we making Shakespeare sound like Snoop Dogg? What's going on over here? And I've just always loved technology and loved to experiment. And so I just opened ChatGPT and started chatting. At the time, I was working on a foresight study for one of my consulting clients, and through all that research and just my direct experience with the tools, I was like, there's no way around the conclusion that AI will be as or more transformative than the internet. And this was, I think, mid 2024 or something. I've since published that study on my Substack. I retained rights to it. It's called Pathways to Prosperity. Like I said, that was in 2024. And since then, I've learned as much as I can about AI personally and professionally. I try to learn about the technical aspects so that I can be a more effective user. I've found that as a non-technical user, I found that my love of language and proficiency with language has been really useful in working with a large language model. I often find the more precise I can be with my words, the better the results that I get. And I've used it for everything from, yes, client analysis, research, different forms of editing and writing support, but I also engage quite a bit in the social and philosophical discourse around its development because I think AI is the primary accelerant in this transformation that my work documents and that I think about. It's really more than hit the gas pedal on where we're going, I think. So, yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. We'll get a link to your Pathways to Prosperity article into the article so people can find it more easily. Can you share a specific story with us about when you've used a tool that has AI or machine learning features? I'd like to hear about how the AI features worked for you or didn't, basically what went well and what didn't go so well.
Yeah. So being self-taught, I basically mess around and find out as much as I can. I don't have necessarily a specific story, but just a smattering of things. I've produced podcasts with Notebook LM. Like I said, I've collected and analyzed data. I've built a web scraper app with Claude. Gemini taught me how to build a second brain in Notion, built numerous microsites. The Deep End retreat site, Claude and I built together. I've never built a website in my life. I have no idea, but I love the learning process. I love asking the models to teach me how to do things and being involved in the production. With the Deep End site specifically, Claude taught me how to deploy through Cloudflare pages and create domain emails through essentially routing and masking an at Gmail address and all of these different things that I would never be able to do by myself, but now can do through curiosity and exploration. And I think when it goes right, it almost feels like magic. And I have lots of those stories. And I think that, yeah, the value is in this cognitive prosthetic function, reducing the translation tax, helping me do these things that I wouldn't have been able to do before. There's so much that's positive in that, but then there's also, it almost does create an extra layer of work because, especially if I'm using it professionally, I really have to trust what I'm putting out. And so there's all of this verification work that has to be done on top of it. When I think about, say, things that have gone wrong to the second half of your question, I told you I moved recently and I needed a floor planner app and I'd run out of freebies on the available tools online. So I was like, Claude, can we build a floor planner app? And Claude was like, absolutely, we can do that, and it just confidently marched me down this direction. And 2, 3 hours later, we still didn't have an app, wasn't actually working. And finally I said, Claude, can you actually do this? Did you have the capabilities to do this? It was like, actually, no, I don't. And so that's a silly version of the story, but I think there's lots and lots of stories people could tell about that where a model confidently marched them down a particular path. And for my particular cognition, it's really easy for me to slip into rabbit holes and I'm really stubborn. I don't tend to just give up when it seems like something's not working. I'm like, oh, I must be doing something wrong. I must not have the technical knowledge to direct this process properly. So I'll get really stubborn too, and I'll keep trying. And the model's never going to give up if you keep pushing. And so I find that one of the biggest risks or things that have gone wrong is essentially wasting time. And then the last thing that came up when I thought about your question was just around, it's a completely different tract of thinking, but there's this purity politics that I find that's coming up right now around AI. I've written a couple pieces about it on my Substack, and I think there's so much nuance. I don't want to bury us in this conversation. I'll just bring it up and leave it, but I think we really need to be thinking hard about why are we reacting to these tools like this? And there's almost this persecution that's starting to happen when people find out that you've used AI in your writing. People won't read you if you've used AI in your writing without any interrogation as to why you used AI and how you used it and what your ethics are about it. AI's really become subject to this very black and white sort of politicized thinking that we've fallen into in a lot of domains. I understand it on the one hand and think it's really scary and problematic on the other. I think you restacked recently a piece I read, Karen. We both read it about the researchers at UVic that did the meta relationality lab where they created the social cartographies. Is that what they called them? And they identified these sort of three perspectives on AI, the blindly anti, the blindly pro, and the nuance, the people who live in the gray and the nuance. I thought it was a really helpful classification of what these emerging purity politics are about.
Yeah, her article was talking about the AI cheerleaders and then the AI, I don't know if she used the word doomers, but that's kind of what it was. And then the people in the middle that are trying to kind of balance saying, yeah, AI's got some problems. It also has some benefits that we need to find a way to gain the benefits and not completely ignore the harms either. And I think you and I both walk that middle line. I got one interesting reaction to that. Like, oh, well, this is still a very negative view. Okay. But the intent is to be balanced, not to be very binary, not one or zero.
Can I ask you, how do you feel about that emerging purity politics? Do you experience it? You're so deep in the space. Obviously, you've created She Writes AI. You brought together, what are we at, like almost 700 of us now. You're publishing books. You could potentially have a very large target on your back, so to speak, for people who feel super strongly about this. Is there anything you're experiencing around this?
Not from She Writes AI, because it's about women who write about AI. It's not necessarily women who use AI. So there are some who are avid users and some who are very much focused on the ethics and here's why I don't use it and here's what we need to be doing to make it less biased, safer, more private and everything else. So in our community, we have the whole spectrum of uses and try to set it up from the beginning so that we can have respectful discussions. We don't get into
disrespect or name calling or anything like that in the subscriber chat. That will get you booted.
Yeah.
It's okay to disagree, but not to be disagreeable about it.
Mm.
I did have one question come up when we published our first book, our AI Everywhere Volume 1, and someone posted a comment to the effect of, I hope this is an anti-AI book. No, it's not. It's not anti-AI. It's also not rabidly pro-AI. The book had 20 chapters from 26 authors from 14 countries, and we had a wide range of views. And that was the point, because that's reality. AI is everywhere and in our world, in our daily life, but people can and should explore for themselves what it means to use it ethically. What does that mean for
Yeah.
them? What are their values? What trade-offs are in their lives that aren't in somebody else's? And how does that affect what they decide? And it doesn't make anybody wrong. But my personal point of view is that everyone needs to define what your values are. Here's what I use AI for based on that. Here's what I don't, and here's why. And if some people publish that, and that's great. Some people, it's just more of an internal exercise. They don't feel comfortable publishing because of the purity politics that you're talking about. And that's okay too. But I'd like to see us get to a world where we're not judging other people. I did an extensive post about that last week, comparing using an LLM to wearing glasses, which you and I both do.
Yeah.
And the bottom line there is that we shouldn't be judging people or shaming them for wearing glasses or for using LLMs, because that's really not the point. I think a lot of the shaming comes from the idea that the tools are inherently unethical. And the major ones, frankly, were not developed ethically. But shaming people who use them doesn't solve anything. Let's go shame the companies. Let's get them to compensate the people whose works they scraped and are now making great profits from. But shaming the people solves nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm excited to check that out. I'm glad I asked you that question because I hadn't seen that piece, and it fits in this big umbrella of cognitive prosthetic, right? Glasses are a prosthetic. They help
Right.
us to do something that our body can't do by itself. So I'm really excited to see your views on that.
Yeah. And some people don't need glasses, but that doesn't mean that they should be shaming people who wear them.
Yeah.
If I had been born with great eyesight and never had to wear glasses, that would be a privilege. But not everybody has those privileges.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole social reactions to the tools and how they use them, it's interesting. And if you think about in the US and maybe in Canada also, they have something similar where for disabilities, the AI tools can be an accommodation, help them offset those disabilities or to be able to function in a way that they couldn't otherwise. That places that say you may not use AI tools are discriminating against people. It's ableist, really. And I think there's some merit to that view, although companies obviously have the right to say, I don't want you putting our confidential information into that tool where it will get scraped and stolen and disseminated to our competitors. But to say that people can't use the tools may be illegal, actually.
Yeah. I wrote a whole section in my piece about the Canada Accessibility Act and how all those laws are going to end up interfacing with AI. And yeah, we're totally on the same page about that. And I actually think it's very underexplored in AI discourse. And I think workplaces are extremely blind to it. I think that it's going to be a very large and specific legal vulnerability for a lot of workplaces moving forward. And it intersects a lot with other issues that workplaces are struggling to deal with already around cognitive diversity and burnout and toxic culture and these types of things. And just because DEI was defunded and weaponized. And so it's a very interesting subject.
Yeah, very cool. So we
Yeah.
talked a lot about using AI tools based on your own values and trade-offs and such. Are there any things that you specifically choose to avoid using AI tools for? If you have any examples of when and why you choose not to use AI for that one purpose.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this and I couldn't come up with a very specific sort of use case in a singular way, but more generally, the one thing that I don't really ever allow myself to do, and it might be to my detriment, honestly, is put out purely generated content. So I won't go to a model and be like, write me a Substack about XYZ and then just post it. I did have one accident where that did happen. And as soon as I realized it, a draft published, basically, I'd put a draft in of a book LM report that I had intended to go back and use as source material, but I put the publication date in wrong on Substack. And so it published. I didn't notice. And so anyway, I left it up and then I just put a note at the top of the piece and I just owned it. I was like, that's what's happened, and decided not to take it down. But yeah, I think myself, a lot of writers, anyone who does any kind of online content creation, I think a lot of us feel a ton of pressure to be very consistent, to put out either multiple pieces, but certainly various types of posts, notes, images, you name it, every single day. And that is not something I'm capable of, at least right now. I'm in this long process of recovering my capacity with my health, but number one, my capacity might not change. This might be it. And number two, my brain and constitution and cognition, it's really wired for these deep dives and these waves of production where I'm really focused on one thing for a while and then I'm moving to the next thing. And that externally reads as inconsistency generally, but especially to an algorithm. And it's very punitive to try to create content and be inconsistent. So it's very seductive to want to use models to keep me consistent and to keep me visible. And for a mix of reasons, my ethics, just generally quality, for better or worse, I really am displeased with the word perfectionist, but I would say that I do hold myself to a very high standard, and it doesn't mean it is excellent to everyone else. But for me, I don't feel like the models develop things that I would feel proud to put out. They don't feel like me, they don't sound like me. And so I get a ton of value through editing with Claude, through revisions, asking Claude to be my reader, getting feedback, implementing it. Like, oh my gosh, most of my pieces have been through 30, 40 plus revision cycles with a model. But I just remain very resistant to pure generation, I guess.
I use analogy sometimes of an iceberg or a duck that is paddling furiously. You just see the duck gliding across the pond and you don't realize how hard it's working underneath the surface to propel itself forward. An iceberg, there's so much more below the waterline that people never see. And I think there are some people who say, write me an article about this, give me 500 words and cover these 3 points, and then they just publish it. But assuming that everybody who uses AI to assist in their writing is doing that is a disservice, because there are people who, like you, go through 30 or 40 revisions where it's definitely being human crafted. I've seen a lot of people write about using AI as a reviewer, not as a writer, but okay, poke holes in this, tell me where the thread of thought breaks down, and then, oh, yeah, you're right, and then go fix that. Or yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. This is fine.
Yeah.
But your human guidance and expertise is what comes through. No, definitely with things that you've written that I've read, it's very, very human, and your thought process comes through. And I would hope no one would actually be avoiding your writing because of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I have had a few people, hasn't been tons, but I can think of 5 or 6 instances where I've had either unsubscribes or borderline vitriolic comments. And I think that is partially due to the changing culture on Substack and more sort of social media, Reddit-esque folks, or maybe even bots coming into the ecosystem. One comment I got in particular was something about like, flop is an immediate block for me. And I'm like, number one, why bother leaving a comment? But number two, the thing that they commented on, I had actually written. What I find so interesting about that leaves a few of our threads is, and I've seen at least a few people in our community write about this, is that there's very strong emerging evidence, at least at the pattern anecdotal level, that neurodivergent writing and AI writing are very similar. There's a whole piece around, it's called gestalt language processing, that's very common in a lot of autistic cognition, where we tend to treat words as like units of meaning, very similar to how an LLM will treat tokens as units of meaning. And there's also a lot of uses of M dashes and parentheticals and different things because our thoughts are flowing in these relational webs. They're not straight linear lines. And so I use AI a lot to help me get to those straight linear lines. But I also independently, with or without AI, I'm going to be using so this leasing of M dashes as conclusive evidence that you have used AI generated writing is just actually increasingly a form of discrimination also. It's very interesting. I won't keep going on it, but I just think, yeah, there's a lot here to be thought about and unpacked. The last thing I'll say is not sure if she's joined our community here with She Writes AI or not, but there was a piece that was going around. I think you also read it. Her name is escaping me, but one of her main points is that folks in positions of power, hierarchically and otherwise, they have access to all kinds of executive assistants and ghostwriters and all of these other forms of additional capacity that are just assumed. It's like if you're going to get published in a magazine or write a book or even send an internal corporate communication and you're the CEO or the vice president or whatever, somebody else wrote that for you for sure. Or if you wrote it, six other people gave you edits on it, and most of us, most people don't pay attention to how large the size of the independent contractor business, like when you look at the breakdown of the size of businesses in Canada, a huge majority are zero employee firms. And so it's people like me, people like you that are just, we're trying to do every single function of the business as well as work in the business. And we deserve to have access to tools that can provide us the kind of resources and support and capacity that is just a given, a neutral, expected given that others have access to. And so I think that's also an important part of the consideration around this stuff.
Yeah, the ghostwriting aspect is, I think, an interesting one, or having the assistants and having people write things for you. Like you said, it's a form of assistance that most solopreneurs simply don't have, and AI is providing that capability for them. And yeah, it doesn't seem fair.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing all those thoughts. So that's a good perspective on using AI and how you're using it. And I think that is important. I haven't, I think, noticed if you have anything on any of your articles saying, I used AI and this is how I used it or why I used it, or if you have an AI policy on your newsletter.
I don't. I've thought about it many times, and I do think aspirationally and ethically, I think I need to do that. I just haven't done it yet. And I have had pieces where, like, I did a series called Normal Zebras, and it was all about these intersections of neurodivergence and AI. And I had a conversation with Gemini in one of them. I did use Gemini initially to help me generate a few paragraphs that I then rewrote, but used as a source material to get me going. And I gave a disclaimer about all that. So I do try to be transparent when it's very obvious, but I think you would have to actually read my work to know that. I think some writers are very good at it's top of line. They acknowledge it right away, or they have even a section header on their Substack site that is like AI policy, these types of things. I think there's a ton of value to that. So yeah, thank you for reminding me about that.
You're welcome. It's something that I encourage when I wrote my Everyday Ethical AI book. It's something that I listed as one of my recommendations, that even if you don't initially share it, just writing it down. Daria Cupariano, I don't know if you read her writing, she's got a lot of really good points. One that she made was this idea of having 3 buckets that you put your work into. 3 zones, she called them. And the one zone is the sacred zone. These are things where the humanness of it matters. And I will never ever do those with AI, like having a conversation like this. I wouldn't send our agents to have this conversation. We do it ourselves because that human interaction matters. And then there are the automation zone. This stuff is just tedious. It's boring. Just made it for me. It doesn't even have to be AI, but just these are things that the more I free myself up from that burden, the better. And then there's kind of an augmented zone in the middle, which is where I still want to retain control over this, but I will use AI assistance for this. And so just thinking about your daily tasks and which of the zones they fall in and why, and then figuring out from there, okay, these are things that I will use AI tools for this way or that way. It's a good way to think about understanding your own ideas. We all have an AI policy, whether it's written down or not. We have a way that we make decisions and we think about what we do and what I'm going to use. I'm not going to use this for that. And thinking it through and writing it down, I think can bring a lot of insight.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great reminder. And thank you also specifically for pointing out Daria and your work as resources, because it's really helpful to have examples, best practices, things to look at as guidance, because it can seem daunting once you put it in the frame of AI policy, But I really like how you just explained Daria's approach. It sounds very humanistic, it doesn't sound like it's very corporate policy. We have, point 1.1a. So yeah, that's cool. Thank you. I'm going to look at that.
Yeah, policy is like the idea of a process when I used to use when I was working in corporate. We all have a process for getting up in the morning, whether we go put on the coffee or we brush our teeth or let the dog out or whatever. We have steps that we go through in the morning, and we don't think about it as a process or write it down as 1.2.3a, but we have one. And sometimes it's helpful to write it down and think about, okay, well, this is what I currently do. What if I did it this way instead? So yeah, processes are like policies. We all have them.
That is great. Processes are like policies. Karen, it's a good one. You give me a lot to think about.
I want to get back to the questions about AI and your thoughts about it. So one concern, we've talked a little bit about this, is these AI tools, most of them are developed by scraping, pulling data from the internet. That's what they use for training, and then they turn that around and sell the access to the tool to us. But in a lot of cases, they have not gotten the consent of the people whose works they took, or they haven't credited them or compensated them for the use of it. And there are some people that advocate what they call the 3 C's of creative rights: consent, credit, compensation. And many people say that this is something that all creative people should be entitled to. If someone takes your Substack newsletter and uses it for training a model, that you should have some rights to it. And other people say it's okay for them to take whatever is publicly available. That's okay with me, where they can take my work. So that doesn't mean that they should have the right to take everybody's. There's a lot of opinions around that. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about companies that get people's data, get people's content, and use it for training these models.
Yeah, it's a complex topic. I could really go on about it, but please help me. I'll stay as tight as possible. It had been the whole conversation. And I'll just, if I can offer a disclaimer and just ask for a little bit of grace, because there's no way to get something so complex right. There's going to be generalizations and exclusions and things. Generally speaking, my first and foundational position is we have to go a layer above AI and look at the systems that we're operating in. Broadly speaking, there is just no ethical participation under capitalism. And that's not a license to not care and to excuse oneself from pursuing more ethical options. It doesn't mean that we can just condone this stealing. I do think that the AI companies stole this work. And I do think that stealing is the right word, because not all of it was in the public domain. And the American government persecuted Aaron Swartz 15 years ago for doing what the AI companies did today. And Aaron, he's not with us anymore. The stress and pain of that experience, he decided to end his life. If that's a case people aren't familiar with, I really encourage you to get familiar with it. Aaron Swartz is a magnificent human being and is very related to the complexity of access to information. He basically downloaded a massive amount of academic journals and then made them publicly freely available on the internet. What I thought Aaron was doing was very ethical, because he was trying to make information freely available and he wasn't trying to profit off of it. And he took a very deep personal risk in doing so. He was trying to do the opposite of the hoarding and privatization of information for profit, whereas now the AI companies are hoarding and privatizing information for profit and total enablement. So I think about those things. There's 1,000 examples. It's very difficult. There's almost nowhere in the supply chain of the production of goods and services, including mine and yours. We're using laptops with mined minerals from the Congo that children probably mined. If you properly stop and think about the full chain and system of what we're participating in, we will always arrive at very unethical and problematic foundations. And so I really try to differentiate the technology versus the company versus the system. So when it comes to consent, credit, and compensation, I don't know how we draw fair and ethical, let alone legal lines around how do we even do that now that it's already been done, I also think about how we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Do you or I pay our mentors, or do we offer financial compensation to every spec writer that we've read or every single person that's influenced us in our career? It's very difficult to do that. We don't do it. One of my mentors once told me all great writers are voracious readers. And I agree so strongly with that. And so am I supposed to then now make an inventory of every single writer who has influenced me and go and pay them? That's not what we're doing. And I think human brains, how do I want to say this? Let me say it this way. So a month or 2 months ago, Sam Altman came under huge fire for comparing humans to AI and saying like, well, we spend all this money and land and resources training humans, feeding them, educating them. And everyone's like, what? It really was quite disgusting in context to think that training AI is more important and more efficient than training a human. And if you take it out of that context as a sort of one-to-one analogy, like human brains absolutely are trained in a very similar way to an LLM, and that we take in this huge corpus of information and then we sense make it and we turn around and make a career out of it and benefit economically, et cetera. And there was no consent, credit, or compensation for any of that in quotations training, And then there's also the issue that like companies were already using our data. They've been using our data since companies have existed. That's what marketing is. Even before we had machine learning or AI or digitization of information and data, you could analyze behavior as data and manipulate it to sell things to people. There's this story that your question for some reason got me thinking about, that the way that women started smoking cigarettes was because Sigmund Freud's nephew sat down and analyzed the behavioral marketplace and was like, women don't smoke because it's culturally unacceptable. And so how can we break those norms and get women to smoke? Like, we'll associate it with emancipation. We will call cigarettes freedom torches. And that's a bunch of data that was collected and analyzed for companies to make a profit. We don't often stop to think the level of sort of saturation and the effects these dominant systems they have on us. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think the only just and ethical answer to this argument is that in the absence of systemic transformation, it has to economically, like directly in dollars and cents into our pockets, benefit every single human alive now and in the future. There's no way to differentiate. Karen Smiley, what compensation should you get for your contribution into the corpus of knowledge that trained AI? And I don't think that this should be a redistribution through governments. I think that's a whole other kettle of fish. I think governments and corporations are not all that different. So AI is forcing not just conversations, but actual structural transformations. And yes, we don't have a solution on the table yet about how we are directly compensating people for the existence of this technology, but there has to be one. I think there is a third way that needs to emerge between public and private that lots of smart people are thinking about. There's lots of possibilities for it. Should there be consented compensation? Yes, but is it actually possible under these current systems? I don't see how, you know?
Yep. Yeah, that's fair enough. So, as someone who uses these tools, do you feel like the providers of the tools that you use have been transparent with you about sharing where they got the data that they used?
No.
That's what I hear from most people. They don't feel that it's been transparent for them. So, as someone who is not necessarily choosing whether or not to use an AI tool, but just as someone who is existing in society, as a consumer, as a member of the public, our personal data and content are probably being used by AI-based tools or systems. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, you and I did some pre-prep on these questions, and I found that I only had these larger systemic perspectives on it. And I guess that's where most of my attention goes on this stuff. I don't have a personal story specifically, but I have these very strong curiosities, or you can call it a founded hunch about my data, your data, our data as citizens is constantly being used by AI tools and systems without our consent and under false pretenses, and often in benign ways, in a sense. The thing that came to mind when I was reflecting on this was there's been this pretty big controversy going on in Canada the last couple of years as the public starts to become more aware of how much government and bureaucratic work is being outsourced to private professional services firms. In 2025, we spent $3 billion outsourcing what would have been internal government work to consulting firms. Deloitte, for example, I was looking this up yesterday, they appeared 39 times in our public accounts, meaning Deloitte had 39 separate engagements across the whole of Canada's government with all these different departments. And one of the departments is employment and social development. They had a $100 million contract with Deloitte for things like informatics services and scientific and research services. And that's the department that administers employment insurance. I've been on employment insurance. What data is the government giving to Deloitte? No one really knows. Oversight is reactive, it's not proactive. And so we won't know until there's been some big leak or error or mistake that gets caught. Is Deloitte just reworking internal systems that have nothing to do with citizen data, or are they directly engaging with citizen data? And then it's not just Deloitte. We have contracts with Palantir. We have huge contracts with Palantir. Canadian government, another big controversy. We spent 44 million bucks on Gotham this year. And then data sovereignty becomes a huge concern in that context because even though Palantir has a Canadian subsidiary, it's still subject to the US Cloud Act, meaning potentially at any point in time, the American government could compel access to our data. So now it's not just personal data potentially being accessed and used by AI companies and put into AI systems, it becomes a geopolitical issue. There's other things I could talk about. I'll pause there instead of continuing on, but I think not so much that I am aware of a specific instance where I know for sure my data was given over. I just think it's functionally impossible to participate in a digital society without our personal data being harvested and exploited. And I think AI just supercharges that process in a way that is discomforting when you think about democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one thing if we have a choice about whether or not you use an AI tool for this or for that, but when it comes to something like government services or tax administration, we can't avoid it. We can't opt out of it. And so it's really extra important there that they behave ethically. Actually, one of our chapters in volume 2 was about tax administration. We have a writer in Argentina who works in that area, and she has some great perspectives on that. But yeah, the government use of our data is really concerning for a lot of reasons. Do you know of any companies that you gave your data or content to that actually told you that they might use your information for training an AI system?
I mean, For sure. Substack, Anthropic. I admit that what should I call it? My AI hygiene is a work in progress. And I do definitely fall into the seduction of the ease, and especially with rebuilding my cognitive capacity over the last couple of years. I have absolutely given Claude bank statements to help me organize my financials or health data. And so it's also interesting to stop and think about the times that I've just willingly given these systems my data, knowing that it could be used for training, but also not necessarily knowing how to stop that. The companies opt in as the default setting, and then opting out is opaque. How do you do that? In Substack, it's buried deep in the settings. I personally didn't find it easy to find, and I only stumbled across it when I was setting up my publication for the very first time. So yeah, I think it's more just the overall practice of software as a service in general has become pretty predatory and pretty anti-user. And these practices are not a mistake. Opting us into things because we signed a terms and conditions that we didn't read because it's in legalese and it's, 10,000 words long and purposely obfuscates what they're actually trying to do. That's asymmetric power that is really problematic. And so do I know of any company that I gave my data or content to that made me aware they might use it for trading? Like all of them, I just assume.
Yeah, Substack is interesting because the opt-out that we have in the newsletter, it's actually for whether or not they try to block third-party crawlers from getting your data. It's not, can they use our data? It's, do you want to block third-party bots, AI bots, from accessing your data or not? And yeah, a lot of people don't notice that the setting is there. I've had a few people say they were surprised to find out about it when I asked them if they had it enabled on their newsletter.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you have it enabled on your newsletter or do you have it disabled?
I am almost certain that I disabled it, and I didn't go back and check, but I remember that it kind of stopped me, and I sat at a computer and thought about it for a while. And at the time, I was feeling a lot more optimistic about AI. Honestly, maybe even a little bit Pollyanna about the ethical side of it. And I remember thinking like, oh, I should make a contribution to developing this monumentally important technology. Who cares? The internet is scraped all the time, AI or no AI. What am I trying to prevent? Why not contribute to making this technology better? And I don't know that I would still stand by that position today. And I don't remember what I did with that toggle.
Yeah, I'm just curious, but like you said, companies have been using and scraping our data for a long time. Do you know of any cases where a company's use of your data has created privacy issues, phishing, loss of income, junk mails, texts, anything like that?
I get spam calls all the time because my phone number is listed in a lot of different places. But no, I can't really think of a really specific instance, honestly. Again, I just kind of assume that it's happening.
Okay. Well, last question, and then we can talk about anything else that you want. Thinking about these AI and tech companies and whether or not we can trust them with our data. Some people say that trust is impossible and unrealistic. Other people say that there are cases under which they could feel like they could trust a company. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think I go back to that much longer answer I gave about there's no ethical participation. And because of that, I think that sows immediate distrust just from the incentive structure that these companies are operating under. Tristan Harris has really excellent analysis and commentary. He makes very accessible this idea of what are the impacts of incentives and how incentives are the whole game. Like, as long as companies are incentivized toward profit and the investment model and this type of thing, we'll continue to see actions that betray trust if the choice point is do something ethical and trustworthy or do something that will make the product more profitable. And we've watched our trust get betrayed. So it's so routine that I think we've lost our sense of agency to do anything about it. We've become quite defeated by how routine the betrayal of trust is. So I don't really know. I do admit that I feel trusting generally toward Anthropic. And I kind of feel like it's a similar feeling as, if there's been a pattern of a type of relationship that has harmed me over and over again. And I'm kind of like, oh, you remind me of the last person I dated and they really hurt me. And I really want to believe in you. You're really presenting as a trustworthy person. You're giving me a lot of signals that I should trust you, but there's just this, something that I don't know. I think you'll probably disappoint me again. So that's sort of how I feel about Anthropic. I'm like, oh, I really want to date you, but I don't think I should.
That's probably a fair analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think it's the people. I think the people in the company are really good. I think the structures they're working in are very untrustworthy and very unethical. I was really impressed by their decision, for example, to decline that government contract a while back that got them first into problems with the administration, and seeing all these different OpenAI employees and other really heavy hitting, highly regarded, talented engineers and really high level folks leave places like OpenAI. And in their tweets and letters and whatnot, they will almost always mention ethics and principles and trustworthiness and these types of things. They'll do it sort of slyly, but if you read it word for word, you're like, oh, you basically just said you don't trust OpenAI and the ethics of that organization. And so you're leaving for a more trustworthy, ethical organization to go to Anthropic. And I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, Karen. Do you feel like you need to redirect me?
No, I think it's good. I don't know, as you said, if there's any company that really can be trusted. I hear a lot of positive things about Anthropic, but then I also just read earlier this week on LinkedIn, actually, and it turned out it was an old story, but with Claude Desktop, they installed some hook that would automatically give Claude access to any tab that you happen to be logged in this browser extension, even though they don't have any of those such things right now. And people would have no way of knowing that they were opting into not just what they put into it in the browser, but every other tab they have open, their bank accounts or anything, health data. And the fact that they deliberately released the extension with that built in just feels like, okay, come on, YouTube.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's any company that really can be fully trusted. There are some, I know the founders, and this is with a lot of startups. In fact, I just interviewed Hodman Murad, and she was talking about her company, Asara. She doesn't collect data from customers, and she's very upfront about telling them what she will and will not collect or do with their data. She doesn't even take a credit card for the free accounts. And so I think founders' values show up, but they can also be degraded by corporate pressures. As you're saying, it's the environment, it's the capitalist ecosystem that they all operate in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is a great conversation, Jen. Thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else that you would like to say? I'd like to hear a little bit more about your retreats, actually. How do you help people recover from this?
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly do not have all the answers at all. And first, I want to say thank you so much, Karen. Again, I really admire what you're doing. I've done a lot of community work and community building work. It's really big load relationally and time and energy, all of it. And you do it with tons of grace and care. And I think I told you once, I feel like you're the fairy godmother of Substack and you actually tend to us. And you notice that if we haven't been around in a while or what's happening, you are to me the definition and embodiment of relational practice. And I just appreciate it, admire, respect it a lot. And what you're
Oh,
doing,
thank
She
you.
Writes, is so cool. It's so cool. It's a real privilege to be part of it and be with you in the conversation.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. It's just true. I will say about the retreats, but may I also ask you what drives you to do this? Like, why did you want to found She Writes AI? What's your founder story for this work?
Yeah, actually, I've been interviewed a couple of times about this. I'll drop you the links to those rather than taking up the time in your interview with it. But just starting from a very young age, I was always conscious of the fact that it was harder for girls and women to make a difference, to be recognized. And we're half the world. Our perspectives, our opinions, our experiences matter. And the impetus for She Writes AI in particular was it's right before Christmas in December 2024. I had finished my shopping and I was just browsing Substack and I found this article. Here's 10 people you should be following about AI on Substack. And how many women do you think were on the list?
Yeah.
Exactly, zero.
None.
And that was kind of a last straw for me. I messaged the guy and he said, "Oh, I just didn't know of any women writing about AI. It's nice to meet you." And I'm like, "You've got to be kidding." I mean, I was already following like 34 women. And I looked for them, but I didn't look that hard. They weren't hard to find. And I thought, okay, no excuses. You want to write a list? Here's 34 to start you with. And then the list just kind of took off from there. The list started growing by leaps and bounds. But the other thing was, I started hearing from women like, "Oh, I mean, I'm not an only, you know?" And that whole sense of we don't need just a directory, we need a community where people can support each other. And so that's how the directory kind of evolved into the community that we have now, which is 1 year old a week ago as of when we're
Hey,
recording this.
amazing.
And it's been really gratifying to see people connect and blossom. It's really been exciting. And I'm really happy about the books. It's giving people an experience that they would have probably found out of reach otherwise. And it's really cool to see people with their book selfies. The pride is just so cool to see that.
Yeah. Being published is a dream come true for any writer. And the way you've done it, there's a lot to feel pride about, I think, in that
Mhm.
particular project.
Yeah. And one thing that I really feel strongly about, there are a lot of communities out there that have a fee. And I understand needing money to try to provide some of the features, but I just don't want there to be any financial barriers for anybody, people between jobs or people in other countries where even $100 is a lot of money. So trying to find ways to do it and keep it free is one of the bigger challenges, but I think it's worth it. We're making some good headway on that. But I want to get back to your retreats.
Yeah, I can't remember how deep I went at the beginning, but it's, I guess, an experience that, in a sense, has been living in me for a long time. It's one of those things that I have found myself dreaming on versions of for a couple years now. And I feel that that's a strong signal to pay attention to. I remember, I don't know if it was Elizabeth Gilbert. I always credit her. I don't know if this is true, but I believe I was listening to her to speak, and she was talking about how ideas are sentient and they'll keep knocking on your door until you pay attention. And if you don't pay attention, they'll leave and go knock on someone else's door. And I feel like this is very emergent through me and just really cool. I've been convening and designing experiences for a very long time. And this feels like taking 20 years of doing that and channeling it into what I hope will be a very intimate experience. So the premise is this, I think I said this in the intro, but the design of our environment impacts us very significantly. And a lot of us don't have autonomy over the design of that environment. And there's all of these very quickly and rapidly advancing fields of practice, like neuro-inclusive design, for example, that really show us that these micro and macro interventions in the environment are very impactful on our actual physiological state. And what we also know from research is that our physiological state, it essentially determines the outcomes that we're capable of. That's what Cal Newport's entire deep work book was about. And the culture of work right now, at least speaking to knowledge work, and I think a lot of other economic domains, but for sure knowledge work, it's frenetic, right? It's the 275 interruptions a day. And the longer you stay in that type of environment, you're training yourself to operate that way. And it can make it harder to get to creative work, to long form thinking, long form writing, strategy. There's so many different needs and applications for doing deep work and what comes from it. So we just really want to take all these learnings. Anna, my partner in this, she's also about 20 years deep in convening and experience design. And so together we're taking all this interest in neuro-inclusive design and state shifting and creating intimate and trusting spaces where you are both in connection with a group, but also have autonomy to rediscover your way of doing your best and deepest work and creating a container for that to happen. We're currently designing it as 5 days on the West Coast. So it'll be here where we live on Vancouver Island near Victoria, BC. And we found an absolutely gorgeous property. We're thinking it's going to be anywhere from 8 to 16 people and bringing you together to create a space where you can go really deep on something that really matters to you. And our only rule for the experience is you can't have meetings. I don't really like rules. I don't like to over program people. That's really important to me. So with some retreat experiences and trainings and whatnot, you're scheduled from the minute you get up to the minute you go to bed. And our intent is to create enough structure to sort of hold people so that you do feel like there's things you can rely on, and also to balance that with enough autonomy that we all work differently, we all create differently. And some of us get in our deepest flow at 1 a.m. and some of us are morning people. And so designing for that to allow for variation and how people access those parts of themselves. Because creativity, I don't think it means painting a picture. Every single human being is creative. And creativity is, in my opinion, largely state dependent. So yeah, we're creating this container for that to happen.
That sounds awesome. So the site is, I think, deependretreats.com.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You also mentioned earlier that you are spinning back up into some consulting work. What would be the best way for someone to get in touch with you if they wanted to learn more about what you do there?
Thank you, Karen. You're so excellent at directing and doing the generous specific question. DM me on Substack would be one way to do that. I don't have a website up yet, but you could email me, Jenn at jenniferangelamcrae.com. Yeah, I think those are probably the two best ways.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Jenn. It was really great talking with you, and I appreciate you making time for the interview and for sharing your thoughts about AI with us.
Oh, so exciting to do it. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for inviting me. It's been very cool. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks, Jenn.
Thank you.
About this interview series and newsletter. This post is part of our AI 6P interview series on AI, software, and wetware. It showcases how real people around the world are using their wetware, brains and human intelligence, with AI-based software tools, or are being affected by AI. And we're all being affected by AI nowadays in our daily lives, perhaps more than we realize. For some examples, see post, but I don't use AI. We want to hear from a diverse pool of people worldwide in a variety of roles. If you're interested in being a featured interview guest, anonymous or with credit, please get in touch. 6Ps and AI Pods. AI 6P is a 100% reader-supported publication. All new posts are free to read and listen to. To automatically receive new AI 6P posts and support our work, consider becoming a subscriber. It's free.